The air inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse was thick with tension, a quiet hum of whispers rippling through the rows of spectators. They had come expecting a routine case, another young defendant facing the full weight of the justice system. But what they were about to witness was anything but ordinary. At the defense table stood 19-year-old Marcus Carter, accused of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. He was young, but the way he carried himself, chin lifted, hands in his pockets, made it clear he wasn't afraid. Across the room, Judge Leonard Grayson, a veteran of the bench, leaned back in his chair, observing the boy with a mixture of amusement and mild irritation. "You think you're some kind of legal expert?" Grayson's voice carried across the courtroom, dry and condescending. "This isn't a debate club, kid." Laughter trickled through the room. The bailiff smirked. The court reporter hid a small grin. Even the prosecutor, Richard Calloway, chuckled as he straightened his tie. To them, Marcus was just another teenager who had gotten in over his head. But Marcus didn't flinch. He had spent years preparing for this, not this exact moment, but moments like it. While other kids memorized basketball stats, he memorized case law. While his friends played video games, he mentally reenacted trials, arguing both sides with himself. His mother, Vanessa Carter, had been a paralegal for over 2 decades, and through her, he had seen how the system truly worked, how some prosecutors cut corners, how judges played favorites, and how many public defenders simply went through the motions. Judge Grayson sighed, flipping open Marcus's case file. "Let's make this quick. I've got a golf game at 2. More laughter. But Marcus smirked because the judge had just made his first mistake. He treated this case like a joke. The courtroom hadn't noticed it yet, but they would. The prosecution was ready. Richard Calloway, an experienced lawyer with a confident stride, rose from his seat. He projected authority, his every movement deliberate as he addressed the jury. "The state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Marcus Carter, was caught red-handed in a stolen 2022 Audi A6. The vehicle had been reported missing just hours before his arrest. Officers pursued him through downtown Los Angeles, where he allegedly attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The prosecution submits that the evidence speaks for itself." The spectators murmured. It sounded damning. A stolen car, a chase, fingerprints on the wheel. Case closed. Judge Grayson glanced at Marcus. "Go on," he said, motioning for Calloway to continue. "The defense," Calloway continued, pacing in front of the jury box, "may try to convince you that this was all a misunderstanding. That Mr. Carter is simply an unfortunate victim of circumstance." He stopped and turned to Marcus, locking eyes with him for the first time. "But let's be honest. What kind of victim runs from the police?" The tension in the room thickened. Judge Grayson leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. "All right. Let's hear the defense's response." He turned to Lisa Thornton, Marcus's court-appointed attorney. Lisa stood hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable. "Your Honor, my client." Marcus placed a hand on her arm, a silent request. She hesitated, then sat back down. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." A ripple of surprise spread through the courtroom. Grayson raised an eyebrow. "You'll what?" "I'll be defending myself." A low murmur filled the room. The bailiff shifted. Calloway smirked. This, they thought, would be entertaining. But as Marcus took a step forward, something shifted. He had spent years watching prosecutors, studying their tactics. And now, he was ready. "Your Honor," Marcus began, "before I present my argument, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution." Calloway raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead." "You said Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel before my arrest." "Correct." "That's right. And that testimony is written in his report." Of course it is. Marcus turned to Judge Grayson. Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence. The judge squinted at him. On what grounds? Marcus pulled his hands from his pockets for the first time and gestured toward the prosecution's table. Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began. A flicker of confusion crossed Calloway's face. What are you talking about? Your Honor, if the court allows, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night. If his report states he witnessed me in the vehicle, then it should match his location history. But, Marcus let the word hang in the air. I have a feeling it won't. The murmurs grew louder. The judge turned to Calloway. Counselor. Calloway hesitated. A fraction of a second too long. And everyone noticed. The jury. The spectators. Even Judge Grayson. Finally, Calloway cleared his throat. No objections, Your Honor. The case was already shifting. Calloway scrambled to regain control. Your Honor, while we wait for the GPS records, the fact remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. Marcus nodded. That's true. He took another step forward. But let's talk about that evidence for a second. He turned to the jury, making eye contact with each juror. The prosecution wants you to believe that finding my fingerprints in a car means I stole it. But let's think logically. If you walk into a store and try on a jacket, your fingerprints will be on it. If that jacket is later stolen, does that mean you're the thief? A few jurors exchanged glances. The car in question was parked outside a 7-Eleven for hours before the theft, Marcus continued. I was there with my friends. And yes, I leaned against the car. I even opened the door because it was already unlocked. But I didn't steal it. Silence. Does touching something make you a criminal? Marcus asked. Calloway flipped through his notes, searching for something, anything. And while we're on the topic, Marcus continued, was the forensic specialist from this case subpoenaed to testify? Grayson frowned. Counselor. Calloway hesitated again. No, Your Honor. Marcus let that settle. So, let me get this straight. The state is using forensic evidence against me, but they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the expert who processed it? No cross-examination. No chance to challenge its accuracy. Silence. Judge Grayson rubbed his temple. He was beginning to see where this was going. But Marcus wasn't done. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence a statement from the owner of the vehicle. Grayson raised an eyebrow. The owner. Marcus nodded. Yes, Mr. Raymond Whitaker, who told police Marcus pulled out a document and read aloud, I left my car running outside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off. But it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid. And he was white. The courtroom gasped. This, Marcus continued, was in the original police report. But it was ignored. Calloway scrambled. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was caught near the stolen vehicle. I wasn't in it, Marcus cut him off. I was blocks away. I wasn't running. I wasn't hiding. I was walking home. Judge Grayson let out a slow breath. He turned to Calloway. Does the prosecution have anything further? Calloway's face was tight. No, Your Honor. Grayson sighed, then spoke the words that changed everything. Case dismissed. A stunned silence. Then, chaos. The spectators erupted. Reporters scribbled furiously. Marcus didn't move. He let the moment settle. As he walked toward the exit, Judge Grayson called out, Mr. Carter. Marcus paused. Grayson hesitated, then said, You should consider law school. Marcus smirked. He was already on his way. The morning sun cast long shadows over the bustling streets of downtown Chicago as Anthony Reed adjusted his tie and stepped out of his car. The municipal courthouse loomed ahead, a building he had walked into hundreds of times as a federal prosecutor. But today was different. Today, he wasn't here on official business. He was here to fight for his family's home. Clutching a folder of carefully prepared documents, Anthony exhaled deeply and made his way up the courthouse steps. The house, left to him by his late grandmother, had been the foundation of his childhood. It was more than just a structure, it was a legacy. But now, a clerical error had led to an unjust property tax adjustment, increasing the tax burden by nearly 30%. Despite weeks of back and forth with the city's offices, no one seemed willing to acknowledge the mistake. This hearing was his last chance to set things right. Inside the courthouse, the air smelled of old paper and burnt coffee, the familiar atmosphere of bureaucratic routine. People clutched documents, whispering anxiously as they waited for their names to be called. Anthony checked his watch, 8:50 a.m. He had made it just in time. His phone buzzed. A message from his assistant back at the U.S. Attorney's office. Judge Whitaker is tough on latecomers. Be careful. Anthony frowned but dismissed it. He had worked under judges far stricter than some municipal court magistrate. What mattered now was the case in front of him. Room 204. He pushed open the door, stepping into the modest courtroom. It was already filling up small claims cases, property disputes, minor infractions. The judge, Charles Whitaker, a tall man with silver-streaked hair and a reputation for efficiency, sat at the bench, rifling through paperwork. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Anthony stood with the others as Judge Whitaker entered. The gavel hit the wood. "Let's get started," the judge said, his tone dry and impatient. The cases moved swiftly, names called, fines issued, disputes settled in minutes. Then, at 9:15 a.m., Anthony heard his name. He straightened his tie and walked toward the podium with confidence. As he reached the front, Judge Whitaker glanced up for the first time, his blue eyes sharp and assessing. "You're late, Mr. Reed," the judge said, irritation creeping into his voice. Anthony's brow furrowed. "Your Honor, I arrived before proceedings began." Whitaker leaned forward, fingers tapping against his desk. "You weren't seated when roll was called." Anthony hesitated, taken aback by the sudden hostility. "I apologize if I missed the call, but I assure you, I was here before court was in session." The judge's lips curled into a smirk. "Apologies don't excuse tardiness. This court operates on discipline, and I won't allow disrespect for procedure. You're fined $750 for contempt." Murmurs rippled through the room. Anthony's grip tightened on the podium. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I believe this is an unfair penalty. I was here before court began." Whitaker's gavel slammed down, silencing the room. "Consider this a lesson in respecting the authority of this courtroom." A heavy silence followed. Anthony's mind raced. He had spent years in courtrooms, had prosecuted high-profile federal cases, yet here he was being penalized for something that others had done without consequence. And then it hit him. The man in the gray suit who had walked in moments after him had gone unnoticed. The woman scrolling on her phone, who arrived even later, had received no reprimand. Only him. This wasn't about tardiness. It was about something deeper. He glanced around the room, reading the expressions of those watching. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others met his gaze with quiet understanding. He wasn't the only one who saw it. He took a slow breath, adjusting his stance. This wasn't just about property taxes anymore. As he walked back to his seat, he pulled out a legal pad and began writing. This wouldn't end here. Minutes passed, but Anthony wasn't listening to the next cases. His mind was elsewhere, his legal instincts kicking into high gear. He started taking notes: names, case numbers, disparities in how each defendant was treated. Then, his name was called again. He returned to the podium, meeting the judge's gaze with steady resolve. "Your Honor, I have here documentation proving that the property tax adjustment on my grandmother's home was applied in error." He opened the folder, presenting clear evidence: city records, previous tax assessments, letters from the assessor's office. He laid it all out with precision, just as he would in a federal case. Judge Whitaker barely glanced at the documents. "I'll review it in due time." A flicker of frustration crossed Anthony's face. "Respectfully, Your Honor, this is a simple case of miscalculation. The evidence is irrefutable." Whitaker sighed, rubbing his temple. "You don't dictate how this courtroom operates, Mr. Reed." Anthony's jaw tightened. He had seen enough judges to recognize when one had already made up his mind. Then he decided to test a theory. "Your Honor, I understand the importance of fairness in this courtroom," he said carefully. "So, I must ask, are these rules applied equally to everyone?" The temperature in the room shifted. Whitaker's eyes narrowed. "Are you questioning this court's integrity?" Anthony kept his voice even. "I'm asking for clarity." The judge's gavel came down hard. "Your fine stands. This discussion is over." Anthony inclined his head. "Understood, Your Honor." But inside, he knew something wasn't right. As court adjourned, he didn't leave right away. He lingered, watching. Others left the room quickly, but a few stayed, exchanging knowing glances. Then, as he walked toward the exit, an older black man approached him. "Son," he said in a hushed voice, "you're not the first to get singled out in his courtroom." Anthony looked at him. "You've seen this before?" The man nodded. "For years." Anthony's jaw tightened. "Then it's time someone does something about it." By the next morning, Anthony had filed a formal complaint with the Judicial Ethics Board. He pulled case records, noting disparities in sentencing, fines, and reprimands. The patterns were undeniable. Judge Whitaker disproportionately penalized black defendants, issued heavier fines for minor infractions, and dismissed leniency requests at a far higher rate. His report gained traction quickly. Within days, the media picked it up. Bias in the courthouse. Federal prosecutor challenges local judge's conduct. Community members came forward with their own stories. A law student who had witnessed the hearing shared her account on social media, sparking a larger conversation. Investigators launched a formal review of Whitaker's rulings. The courthouse staff, once silent, began speaking up. A longtime court clerk admitted to keeping notes of questionable rulings for years. The pressure mounted. 2 weeks later, Judge Whitaker was placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. When the news broke, Anthony stood outside the courthouse, reporters surrounding him. "Mr. Reed, what do you hope comes from this?" He met the cameras with unwavering resolve. "Justice," he said simply. "For everyone." As he walked away, he glanced back at the building, once a place where injustice thrived in silence. Not anymore. Not if he had anything to do with it. The Los Angeles County Courthouse buzzed with low murmurs as spectators filled the gallery, eager for another day of routine legal proceedings. The air was thick with anticipation, but few in the room knew they were about to witness something extraordinary. At the defendant's table stood a young man who, by all appearances, seemed out of place. His hands were in his pockets, his chin lifted just enough to show he wasn't afraid. 19-year-old Marcus Caldwell, accused of grand theft auto and resisting arrest, was facing charges that could alter the course of his life. The weight of the accusations was heavy, but the real trial he was facing had nothing to do with the law. It was about perception. At the bench, Judge Harold Whitmore leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the polished wood. He peered at Marcus over the rim of his glasses, lips curling into something between a smirk and a sneer. You think you're some kind of legal expert? The judge's voice carried dry amusement. This isn't a debate club, kid. A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff, the stenographer, even the prosecutor. They were all in on the joke. Marcus didn't flinch. He wasn't laughing. He had spent years preparing for this moment, not this exact one, of course, but he knew the courtroom like the back of his hand. While other kids memorized basketball stats, he memorized case law. While his friends played video games, he played mock trials in his head, arguing imaginary cases with himself. His mother, Denise Caldwell, had worked as a paralegal for over 20 years, and Marcus had grown up listening to her stories of prosecutors cutting corners, judges playing favorites, and defense attorneys who barely tried. He absorbed everything. By the time he was 14, he could break down a trial better than most law students. But none of that mattered to Judge Whitmore. To him, Marcus was just another young black man who had made a bad decision. Let's make this quick, the judge sighed, flipping open the case file. I have a golf game at 2. Laughter from the audience. But Marcus caught something the rest of the courtroom had missed. Whitmore had just made his first mistake. The prosecutor, Robert Langford, rose from his seat with the air of a man who had already won. His suit was crisp, his tie perfectly knotted, and his voice carried the confidence of someone who had delivered the same speech 100 times before. Your Honor, the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Marcus Caldwell, was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle, a 2022 Audi A6, reported missing just hours before his arrest. Officers pursued him through downtown, where he allegedly attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The prosecution submits that the evidence speaks for itself. The weight of his words landed. The gallery stirred, whispers passing between spectators. On the surface, it sounded like an open and shut case, a stolen car, a chase, an arrest. Judge Whitmore glanced at Marcus over his glasses. Go on. Langford walked toward the jury box, polished shoes clicking against the floor. The defense may try to convince you that this was all a misunderstanding, that Mr. Caldwell is some unfortunate victim of circumstance. He turned, locking eyes with Marcus. But let's be honest, what kind of victim runs from the police? Tension thickened in the room. Judge Whitmore leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. Marcus didn't blink. Langford flipped through a stack of papers. Your Honor, I have here the testimony of Officer Daniel Ruiz, who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to flee. The car was confirmed stolen. The arrest was made by the book. Judge Whitmore exhaled through his nose, nodding. Sounds straightforward to me. For most people in the room, it probably did. But Marcus saw the cracks. Still, he waited. Judge Whitmore tapped his gavel lightly. All right, let's hear the defense's response. The public defender, Lisa Thornton, rose from her chair, shifting nervously. Your Honor, my client. Marcus placed a hand on her arm, a silent request. She hesitated, then sat back down. And for the first time, Marcus spoke. I'll be representing myself, Your Honor. The room fell silent. Whitmore stared at him, amused. You'll what? Marcus's voice was steady. I'll be defending myself. A murmur spread through the courtroom. The bailiff's eyebrows shot up. Langford's smirk faltered for just a second before he let out a sharp laugh. This should be interesting. But no one was laughing when Marcus took his first step forward. Because everything was about to change. He adjusted his stance, hands still in his pockets, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable. Then finally, he spoke. Your Honor, before I begin, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution. Langford raised an eyebrow. Go ahead. You said Officer Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel before I was arrested, correct?" Langford exhaled sharply. "That's right. And that testimony is written in his report." "Of course it is." Marcus nodded, then turned to Judge Whitmore. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence." Whitmore squinted at him. "On what grounds?" Marcus pulled his hands from his pockets for the first time and gestured toward the prosecution's table. "Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began." A flicker of confusion crossed Langford's face. "What are you talking about?" Marcus took another step forward. "Your Honor, if the court allows, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night. If his report says he witnessed me in the vehicle, then it should match his location history. But," he let the word hang in the air, "I have a feeling it won't." The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Judge Whitmore glanced at Langford. "Counselor." Langford hesitated. Marcus took a quiet breath. He had studied prosecutors for years. If Langford was confident, he wouldn't be stalling. Whitmore sighed, rubbing his temple. "Does the prosecution have any issue with verifying the officer's GPS logs?" Langford clenched his jaw. "No objections, Your Honor." But the shift had already begun. Marcus wasn't done. "The prosecution also mentioned fingerprint evidence," he continued. "Let's talk about that." He turned to the jury. "The prosecution wants you to believe that finding my fingerprints in a car means I stole it. That's the story they're selling. But let's think about this logically." He took a deep breath, his tone staying calm, controlled. "Let's say you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets, zip it up, then put it back. Hours later, someone steals that jacket. Would the fact that your fingerprints are on it mean you stole it?" The jury exchanged glances. The car in question was parked outside a 7-11 hours before the alleged theft. "I was inside that store with 3 friends. When we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door because it was already unlocked. But I didn't take the car." He let that sit before delivering the final blow. "And let's talk about the vehicle's owner, Raymond Wallace." Langford's face paled. Marcus pulled out a transcript. "In his statement to police, he said, 'I saw the kid who stole my car. He was white.'" Gasps filled the room. Marcus turned back to Whitmore. "The officers ignored that statement. The prosecution omitted it. But they still want this jury to believe I'm guilty beyond a reasonable doubt." Silence. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat. "Does the prosecution have anything further?" Langford's face was flushed. "No, Your Honor." Whitmore let out a slow breath. Then, finally, he spoke. "Case dismissed." The courtroom erupted. Marcus didn't move right away. He let the moment settle. Then, as he turned to leave, Whitmore spoke again. "Mr. Caldwell." Marcus stopped. "You should consider law school." Marcus smirked. He already had. The morning sun had barely begun its ascent when Judge Olivia Marshall stepped out of her car in front of the Franklin County Courthouse. Clutching her briefcase in one hand and her coffee in the other, she took a deep breath. It was going to be a long day. She had a full docket, including one case that had already drawn media attention, a civil rights lawsuit alleging wrongful arrest due to racial profiling. As she adjusted the sleeves of her judicial robe and started toward the courthouse steps, she noticed the faint hum of city life awakening around her. The scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted from a nearby cafe, mingling with the morning air. The quiet was a brief reprieve before the storm she expected in court today. Just as Olivia reached the courthouse entrance, a voice rang out behind her. "Ma'am, I need to see some ID." She turned, raising an eyebrow. A uniformed police officer stood a few feet away, one hand resting on the radio clipped to his vest. His posture was rigid, his expression unreadable behind his dark sunglasses. For a second, Olivia thought he might be addressing someone else, but when she glanced around, the sidewalk was empty aside from a few pedestrians hurrying past. She frowned. "Excuse me." The officer took a step closer. "I need to see some identification," he repeated, his voice firm but devoid of explanation. Olivia's grip tightened around her briefcase. "And why is that?" "You're in a restricted area," he said, nodding toward the courthouse entrance. Olivia glanced at the building behind her, the same one she had walked into nearly every morning for the past 5 years. "A restricted area," she echoed, a hint of incredulity in her tone. The officer stiffened. "Yes, ma'am. Only authorized personnel are allowed through here." Olivia's pulse quickened, not with fear, but with the sharp sting of recognition. She had seen this happen before to colleagues, to friends, to complete strangers. But now, it was happening to her. "Officer, do you know who I am?" she asked, keeping her voice even. His expression barely flickered. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see your ID." She exhaled slowly, suppressing the frustration simmering beneath her calm exterior. There were 2 ways this could go. She could comply, pull out her identification, and let him see for himself. Or, she could make a point. She chose the latter. "What's your name, officer?" she asked instead. His jaw tightened. "That's not relevant." "It is if you're stopping me from entering the courthouse where I preside as a judge," she said smoothly. A beat of silence passed between them. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed the officer's face. "I'm Judge Olivia Marshall," she said, her voice carrying the full weight of her title. "And I don't need an ID to enter my own courthouse." A beat of silence stretched between them before the officer shifted awkwardly, adjusting his stance. I was just following protocol, ma'am." "Protocol?" Olivia repeated, tilting her head. "Tell me, officer, how many other people have you stopped this morning?" His mouth opened, but no words came out. "I assume you've stopped the attorneys walking in." "The clerks." "The other judges." Her gaze was steady, unrelenting. The officer cleared his throat. I didn't mean any disrespect." "I'm sure you didn't," she said. "But that doesn't change what just happened." Another officer nearby had noticed the exchange and was now approaching. This one, a senior officer, recognized her immediately. "Good morning, Judge Marshall," he said, nodding respectfully. The first officer hesitated, then took a step back. "Apologies, Judge. It won't happen again." She gave him one last measured look before turning on her heel and walking into the courthouse. It was a small moment. A brief exchange. But it wasn't insignificant. And as Olivia took her seat behind the bench later that morning, presiding over a case about racial profiling, she couldn't help but wonder, how many others weren't in a position to push back? How many others had been stopped, questioned, and dismissed without the authority to challenge it? She glanced at the plaintiff, a black man in his mid-30s, sitting beside his attorney at the defense table. He had been pulled over for matching a description and forcibly removed from his car before being cleared of any wrongdoing. The arrest had cost him his job and left him humiliated. "Counselor, you may proceed," she said, her voice steady. The prosecution began its argument, laying out their evidence with careful precision. The defense countered, arguing that the officers had acted within reason, that their client had been suspicious, and that it was all just an unfortunate misunderstanding. But Olivia knew better. She had felt the sting of doubt in that officer's voice, the hesitation when confronted with authority he hadn't expected. The trial lasted the entire afternoon, with testimony after testimony painting a picture of a man wrongfully accused. As the evidence unfolded, Olivia watched the jury, gauging their reactions. Some were skeptical, but others seemed disturbed by what they were hearing. The defense attorney tried to paint the case as an overreaction. "Your Honor," he said, standing before her. "The officers made a judgment call. It wasn't personal." Olivia folded her hands. "Not personal," she repeated. The attorney hesitated. "No, Your Honor." "Then why does it keep happening?" she asked, her voice even. Silence filled the courtroom. By the time closing arguments were made, the weight of the case settled heavily in the room. The jury was excused to deliberate, and Olivia leaned back in her chair, her mind circling back to her own encounter that morning. She had walked away from it unscathed. The man sitting at the defense table had not. It didn't take long for the jury to return with a verdict. "We find the defendant guilty." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Olivia nodded, allowing the moment to settle before she addressed the court. "This case," she said, "is about accountability. It is about the presumption of guilt that has followed certain communities for far too long." She turned to the convicted officer, who stood at the defense table, his expression unreadable. "This court does not take these matters lightly," she continued. "And today, the system holds you accountable." With the sentence delivered, Olivia gavelled the court into recess. As she exited the bench, she glanced toward the gallery, where the plaintiff sat with his attorney, relief washing over his face. It wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about her. It was about something bigger. Outside, the sun had started its descent, casting long shadows against the courthouse steps. As Olivia descended, she spotted the same officer from that morning standing near his patrol car. He looked up as she approached, his posture uncertain. "Judge Marshall," he said. She stopped. "Officer." I just wanted to say I'm sorry," he said, shifting uncomfortably. "I didn't mean to." She held up a hand, cutting him off. "Officer, I don't need an apology. I need you to think about why you did it." He swallowed, nodding. "Have a good evening," she said, before continuing down the steps. As she walked toward her car, she knew the day's events would stick with her for a long time. And maybe, just maybe, it would stick with him too. The early morning sun cast long golden streaks over Cedar View's City Hall, illuminating the rows of parked police cruisers outside the station. It was Chief Kendra Lawson's first day on the job, and she had arrived early, long before the rest of the department, to settle into her new office. The weight of her new role pressed against her shoulders, but she stood tall. Cedar View wasn't just any town, it was a place with a long history, one where the relationship between law enforcement and the community had been strained for decades. The town's black residents had long complained about biased policing, racial profiling, and a lack of accountability. As the first black woman appointed as chief of police, Kendra knew all eyes were on her, waiting to see what she would do. She had spent the last 15 years working in one of the largest police departments in the state, leading reforms, earning the respect of her peers, and proving time and again that she was more than capable of the position she now held. But she also knew that no amount of experience could prepare her for the challenges she would face in Cedar View. Still, she was ready. After placing a framed picture of her parents on her desk, Kendra grabbed her keys and decided to take a drive before her official introduction to the department. She wanted to get a feel for the town on her own, without the filtered perspective of department reports or official briefings. She didn't need a badge or a uniform to understand the pulse of a place. She just needed to see it with her own eyes. She slid into her black sedan and pulled out of the parking lot, driving through Cedar View's main streets, taking in the early morning quiet. The town was a blend of old and new. Historic buildings lined the streets, their facades worn but full of character, while newer developments stood just a few blocks away, a sign of Cedar View's slow but steady modernization. After a few minutes, she turned onto a familiar stretch of road leading toward her new neighborhood. She had bought a house just outside the city center, wanting to be part of the community she would serve. As she approached a stop sign, a pair of flashing red and blue lights suddenly lit up behind her. Kendra frowned, glancing at her rearview mirror. A police cruiser was tailing her, its siren giving a short burst. A traffic stop. For a moment, she considered what to do. She was the chief of police. The officers in that cruiser technically worked for her now. But she also knew that none of them had met her yet. Her official introduction was still hours away. She pulled over, rolled down her window, and placed her hands on the steering wheel, keeping them visible. She had trained officers on de-escalation for years, had spoken at conferences about the importance of fair policing, and yet, even now, she felt the familiar tightness in her chest that so many black drivers experienced during encounters with the police. Two officers stepped out of the cruiser. Both were young, white, and radiating the kind of authority that came from knowing they had power. The taller one approached first, resting his hand on the grip of his holstered weapon as he leaned toward her window. "License and registration," he said flatly. Kendra kept her voice calm. "May I ask why I was stopped, officer?" The second officer, standing just behind his partner, scoffed. "Ma'am, we ask the questions. You were driving in a suspicious manner." Kendra raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious how?" The first officer narrowed his eyes. "This isn't an interrogation. I said, license and registration." Kendra exhaled slowly, suppressing the sharp retort on the tip of her tongue. She knew this routine well: vague reasoning, an unnecessary escalation of authority, the immediate assumption of guilt. Still, she reached into her glove compartment, moving deliberately, and pulled out her documents, handing them over. The officer took them, barely glancing at her name before walking back toward the squad car. The second officer remained by her window, studying her. "You live around here?" he asked. Kendra met his gaze evenly. "I do." He let out a small, skeptical huff. "Haven't seen you before." "Does everyone in town have to check in with you?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. His jaw tightened. Before he could answer, the first officer returned, looking at her license again, this time more closely. Something shifted in his face. A flicker of recognition. He looked from the ID to her face, then back again. His posture changed. "Oh, Chief Lawson." Kendra didn't move. "That's right." A visible wave of discomfort passed between the two officers. The second officer straightened, his earlier confidence replaced with uncertainty. We didn't realize," the first officer stammered. "That I was your boss," she finished for him. Silence. The officers glanced at each other. Kendra could almost hear the calculations running through their heads: how to backtrack, how to smooth over what had just happened. She let them sweat for a moment before speaking. "So, tell me. Was this a routine traffic stop?" The first officer swallowed. Just standard patrol, ma'am." Kendra let out a dry laugh. "Right. So, would you say I was pulled over because I was breaking the law, or because I was a black woman in the wrong neighborhood?" The officers flinched at her bluntness. "Chief, we were just doing our jobs," the second officer said quickly. Kendra studied them. "You might think that. But let me be clear: if this is how you police the people of this town, we have a serious problem." They didn't respond. She took back her license and registration, keeping her expression unreadable. "Report to my office at noon. We're going to have a conversation about bias and accountability." The officers nodded stiffly before retreating to their cruiser. Kendra watched them pull away, then took a slow breath. So much for easing into the job. By the time noon arrived, Kendra was seated at her desk, reviewing department policies when the two officers arrived. They knocked hesitantly, stepping inside with none of the bravado they had displayed that morning. "Take a seat," she said without looking up. They obeyed. She set down her papers and folded her hands. What happened this morning was not just a mistake. It was a reflection of a much larger issue in this department. The first officer, the taller one, nodded quickly. Chief, we never meant. She held up a hand. Stop. This isn't about intent. It's about impact. They fell silent. I have spent my career working to build trust between communities and the officers sworn to protect them, Kendra continued. And in my very first hour in this town, I got to experience firsthand why that trust is broken. The second officer, the younger one, looked down at his hands. Let me be clear, she said. I will not tolerate racial profiling in this department. I will not tolerate officers who abuse their power. And I will not allow Cedar View to continue down the same path it has been on for years. The words hung heavy in the room. You both have a choice, Kendra said finally. You can acknowledge your mistakes and commit to doing better, or you can walk out that door and keep pretending this morning never happened. Neither spoke for a moment. Then, slowly, the first officer nodded. I want to do better, he said. The second officer hesitated, then exhaled. Me too. Kendra nodded once. Then we start now. That evening, as Kendra walked through the streets of Cedar View, she saw the town differently than she had that morning. The work ahead was daunting, but she was ready. Change wouldn't come overnight, but it would come. Because she would make sure of it. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the courthouse, casting long beams of light across the polished wood floors. Judge Eleanor Marshall took a deep breath, adjusting the sleeves of her robe as she prepared for another day on the bench. She had spent years climbing to this position, a black woman presiding in a courtroom where people who looked like her had historically been at a disadvantage. Every case she handled carried weight, but today's case would test her resolve in a way she never expected. As the bailiff called the first case, Eleanor settled into her chair, scanning the docket in front of her. The State of Louisiana versus James Anderson, the bailiff announced. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. James Anderson. She looked up just as the defendant was led into the courtroom, his wrists and ankles shackled. Her world tilted. The man standing before her wasn't a stranger. James was her childhood best friend. For a brief moment, Eleanor wasn't Judge Marshall. She was Ellie, the little girl from Hammond, Louisiana, who used to sit under a magnolia tree with James, whispering about their dreams for the future. But the boy she remembered wasn't the man standing in front of her now. His once bright eyes were clouded with exhaustion, his shoulders slumped with the weight of a hard life. Yet, beneath it all, the spark of recognition was still there. James saw her, too. He blinked, his expression unreadable, before dropping his gaze. Eleanor forced herself to focus. The charges in front of her were serious assault, robbery, and resisting arrest. She could already feel the room watching her, waiting for her reaction. Mr. Anderson, she said, keeping her voice steady, how do you plead? His voice, rough and unfamiliar, came out stronger than she expected. Not guilty, Your Honor. Eleanor's heart pounded, but she nodded. Proceed. The prosecutor, Richard Powell, stood with the practiced ease of a man who had done this 100 times. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is straightforward, he began, pacing in front of the jury. The defendant, James Anderson, was seen on surveillance footage robbing a convenience store in Baton Rouge. The store clerk was injured in the attack. Mr. Anderson was arrested just a few blocks away, with cash from the register still in his possession. The evidence speaks for itself. The words settled over the courtroom like a heavy fog. Eleanor stole a glance at James. He didn't react. The defense attorney, Lisa Porter, stood next. She was young but confident, her voice firm. Your Honor, we will prove that my client is innocent. That the evidence against him is circumstantial at best and that the investigation was riddled with inconsistencies. Eleanor listened intently. She had seen cases like this before: black men accused, their guilt assumed before they even stepped into a courtroom. But she couldn't let personal history cloud her judgment. She had to stay neutral, even if every fiber of her being told her something was wrong. The first witness, the store clerk, was called to the stand. He recounted the night of the robbery, his voice steady. "He was wearing a red hoodie. He jumped over the counter and hit me when I tried to stop him." Lisa stepped forward for cross-examination. "You said the suspect was wearing a red hoodie?" "Yes." Lisa walked over to the evidence table. "Do you see a red hoodie in the evidence collected from my client?" The prosecutor shifted in his seat. The clerk hesitated. "No." Lisa nodded. "So, we have no physical evidence tying my client to the crime. Only that he was nearby." Powell quickly stood. "Your Honor, the defendant's fingerprints were found on the cash." Lisa turned, eyes sharp. "And was a forensic specialist brought in to verify those prints? Or was it assumed because Mr. Anderson has a prior record?" Powell's lips pressed into a thin line. "The evidence is clear." Lisa didn't back down. "No, it's convenient." Eleanor exhaled slowly. Lisa was good. But was it enough? During the lunch break, Eleanor sat in her chambers, staring at the walls. A soft knock broke her thoughts. Her assistant, Margaret, peeked in. "Judge Marshall?" "You seemed distracted." Eleanor hesitated. Should she tell her that the man on trial wasn't just another defendant to her? "I'm fine," she finally said. Margaret studied her before nodding. "All right. Just know, whatever's on your mind, you can talk about it." Eleanor nodded, but as the door closed, she knew this wasn't something she could share. This was her burden to carry. That afternoon, Lisa called her key witness, Officer Daniel Harris, the arresting officer. Eleanor sat up straighter. Lisa's tone was calm but firm. "Officer Harris, you stated that my client was apprehended 2 blocks from the store." "Yes." "And you identified him as the suspect based on what?" "He matched the description." Lisa stepped closer. "A vague description." "A black man in his 40s wearing dark clothing." Officer Harris's jaw tightened. It was enough. Lisa glanced at the jury before turning back. "Did you find a red hoodie on him?" "The one the store clerk mentioned." "No." "Did you find any surveillance footage showing my client committing this crime?" Officer Harris hesitated. "Not clearly." Lisa turned to Eleanor. "Your Honor, I request that we subpoena the full surveillance footage from that night, not just the portion shown by the prosecution." Powell immediately objected. "Your Honor, the footage already presented is sufficient." Eleanor raised a brow. "Is it?" Silence. "The request is granted," she ruled. The unease in Powell's expression told her everything she needed to know. The next day, when the full footage arrived, everything changed. Lisa played the video in its entirety. The quality was poor, the lighting dim, but one thing became clear: the suspect in the video was not James. The figure was shorter, thinner, and white. The courtroom gasped. Lisa turned to the jury. "My client does not even match the description given by the store owner. Yet, he was arrested. Why? Because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or because officers decided he fit their expectation of a suspect?" Eleanor swallowed hard. Powell scrambled. "This doesn't prove he didn't commit the crime. He was found with the money." Lisa stepped forward. "Money that could have been planted. Or mistaken. My client never ran. He wasn't even in the store. And yet, he was treated as guilty." She turned to Eleanor. "Your Honor, I motion for dismissal." Eleanor stared at the screen. At James. At Powell. She knew what she had to do. The jury has reached a verdict. Eleanor asked hours later. The foreperson stood. We find the defendant, James Anderson, not guilty. The courtroom erupted. James exhaled sharply, his body sagging with relief. Eleanor tapped her gavel. Order. When the room quieted, she looked at James. Mr. Anderson, you are free to go. He looked at her for the first time with something more than just recognition. Gratitude. She nodded. As the courtroom emptied, James lingered. He approached her bench, hesitating. Ellie. She smiled faintly. It's Judge Marshall now. James chuckled, shaking his head. Guess you always were the one meant to make the rules. Eleanor studied him. And you were always the one fighting them. James exhaled. I never thought I'd get a fair shot. But you. She raised a hand. I did what was right. That's what justice is supposed to be. He nodded. Thank you. As he walked away, Eleanor knew this case had changed more than just one life. It had changed the system. And she would keep fighting to make sure it stayed that way. The morning sun had barely risen over Cedar View when Kendra Hayes stepped into the police station for her first day as chief of police. The town, nestled in the heart of the Midwest, was small but deeply divided, a place where the past had a firm grip on the present. Kendra had known this wouldn't be an easy job. Cedar View's police department had long been accused of racial bias, and she was here to change that. She took a deep breath as she adjusted her uniform, the crisp navy fabric fitting snugly over her shoulders. The badge on her chest gleamed under the station's fluorescent lights. This was more than just a title. This was history in the making. Her first order of business was an early morning meeting with the department's leadership. She was ready to set the tone for the new era of policing in Cedar View. But first, she needed coffee. She stepped out of the station and into her car, deciding to stop by a local coffee shop before the meeting. It wasn't far, a quick 10-minute drive down Main Street. The town was just beginning to wake up, and the streets were relatively empty. But as she pulled up to a red light, she noticed the patrol car behind her. The blue and red lights flicked on. Kendra frowned. A traffic stop? She knew she hadn't done anything wrong. Still, she signaled, pulled over to the side of the road, and exhaled slowly. Seconds later, two officers approached, one on each side of her car. The driver's side officer, a tall, broad man with a sharp jawline, motioned for her to roll down her window. Kendra did as instructed. Morning, officers. The officer narrowed his eyes. License and registration. Kendra tilted her head. No greeting. No explanation. Just an immediate demand. What's the reason for the stop? She asked, keeping her voice calm. The second officer, younger and visibly tense, shifted on his feet. Your vehicle matches the description of one reported stolen. Kendra raised an eyebrow. She knew for a fact that wasn't true. She had registered this SUV in her name just weeks ago when she moved to Cedar View. But she also knew what was happening. Profiling. She had seen it happen countless times, officers pulling over black drivers on flimsy excuses, searching for any reason to escalate. And now, even as the chief of police, it was happening to her. She glanced at the officers' badges. The older one was Officer Daniels. The younger one, whose nervous energy was almost palpable, had the name tag Mitchell. Daniels tapped the roof of her car impatiently. License and registration. Now. Kendra took a deliberate breath before reaching into her glove compartment. She had learned early on in her career that sudden movements could be misinterpreted. She pulled out her documents and handed them over. Daniel snatched them without a word and walked back to the patrol car. Mitchell lingered. He was young, probably mid-20s. His grip tightened on his belt, and for a brief second, Kendra wondered if he recognized her. But if he did, he didn't say anything. The radio in the patrol car crackled. Kendra couldn't hear what was being said, but she knew what was happening. Daniels was running her plates, trying to justify the stop. It would take them mere moments to realize their mistake. Minutes ticked by. Kendra drummed her fingers against the steering wheel, watching Daniels through the side mirror. His posture had shifted slightly. The arrogance in his stance had been replaced with something else. Unease. Finally, he returned to her window. His jaw was tight as he handed back her license. "You're free to go," he muttered. Kendra took her time accepting her documents. "That's it?" Daniels exhaled sharply. "What else do you want?" "A reason," she said, locking eyes with him. "A real one." His nostrils flared, but he didn't answer. Mitchell, still standing awkwardly by her passenger side window, finally spoke. "It was a mistake." Kendra studied him. He looked uncomfortable, almost embarrassed. He knew they had messed up. "A mistake," she repeated. "Tell me, Officer Mitchell, how often do these mistakes happen in Cedar View?" Mitchell didn't respond. Daniel stiffened. "You're free to go," he said again. Kendra nodded slowly. "All right." She reached for the door handle. And then she stepped out. Immediately, Daniel's posture changed. His hand hovered near his holster, his instincts kicking in. Kendra didn't react. She stood tall, folding her arms as she watched both officers shift uncomfortably. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice even. "I think it's time we had a talk." Daniels narrowed his eyes. "Excuse me." Kendra took a step forward. "I'm Kendra Hayes, your new chief of police." The silence that followed was deafening. Mitchell's mouth opened slightly, then shut. His face paled. Daniels, on the other hand, went rigid. Kendra let them sit in that moment. Let them feel the weight of what they had just done. Then, she smiled. "Let's head back to the station, shall we? I think we need to discuss some policies." The tension in the briefing room was thick enough to cut with a knife. The entire department, every officer, detective, and administrator had gathered for Kendra's first official meeting. But instead of a routine introduction, the atmosphere was charged. Because word had spread. Every officer in that room now knew what had happened to their new chief that morning. Kendra stood at the front, scanning the faces in front of her. Some looked uncomfortable. Others avoided eye contact. A few, Daniels included, sat with their arms crossed, defiant. Good. They needed to be uncomfortable. She set her hands on the podium. "Let's talk about policing," she began, her voice clear and unwavering. "Specifically, the way it's been done in Cedar View." A murmur rippled through the room, but no one interrupted. "I won't waste time sugarcoating this," she continued. "This department has a reputation. And not a good one." She let that settle. Over the past 5 years, reports of racial profiling have increased by nearly 40%. Traffic stops disproportionately target Black and Latino residents. Use of force incidents have followed the same pattern. Some officers shifted in their seats. Others stiffened. Kendra glanced at Daniels, who held her gaze, unflinching. "I experienced it firsthand this morning," she said. "A baseless traffic stop. No reason. No explanation. Just an assumption." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Kendra exhaled slowly, then stepped out from behind the podium. "Let me make something clear," she said, walking forward. "This isn't about politics. It's about trust." She turned to the room, making eye contact with each officer she passed. "We cannot do this job if the people we serve don't trust us," she said. "And right now, trust in this department is broken." She stopped, letting the silence speak for itself. Then, she straightened. That changes today. She walked back to the front. New policies are being implemented immediately. First, implicit bias training is mandatory. No exceptions. Second, body cameras must be activated during all stops. Failure to do so will result in disciplinary action. Third, community oversight will be established to review complaints of misconduct. A few officers grumbled. She ignored them. And finally, she added, her voice firm, I expect professionalism. Accountability. If you can't uphold that, you don't belong in this department. Silence. Then, a voice spoke. It was Officer Mitchell. He cleared his throat. Chief Hayes, he said cautiously. I just wanted to say. I should have spoken up this morning. I knew that stop was wrong. Kendra met his gaze. He looked genuinely remorseful. She nodded. Acknowledging it is the first step, Officer Mitchell. What matters now is what you do next. He nodded, determined. Kendra looked out at the room one last time. Change is coming, she said simply. And I hope you'll be part of it. With that, she stepped back, letting the weight of her words settle. Some officers looked resistant. Others seemed thoughtful. It didn't matter. Because one thing was clear. Cedar View wasn't going to be the same anymore. And that was exactly what she intended. The story of Chief Kendra Hayes highlights a powerful lesson about leadership, accountability, and the necessity of change. As we navigate life, we often encounter systems and traditions that have existed for decades, some helpful, others deeply flawed. Kendra's experience reminds us that challenging the status quo isn't easy, but it is necessary for growth. For many older Americans, this lesson is particularly relevant. We've seen society evolve, sometimes for the better and sometimes not fast enough. But change doesn't just happen, it requires courage, persistence, and a willingness to have difficult conversations. Whether in our communities, families, or personal lives, we must be open to reflection and improvement. If we want future generations to inherit a world that is fairer and more just, we must support leaders who prioritize integrity over comfort. The way Kendra stood her ground despite resistance serves as a reminder that real progress isn't about avoiding conflict, it's about facing it with wisdom and conviction. As we age, we have a choice, to resist change out of habit or to embrace it with the knowledge that making things better is a responsibility that never ends.